Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens,
Yeah, actually, I have. It's really one session, but it's over, or one talk, but over two sessions. I don't know. So I'll get these guys to
Good evening. What? Oh. Are we ready? Okay, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you for coming to our keynote address in recognition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. My name is Dr. Heidi Schneider. I am the Department Chair of Sociology and also the Inclusive Excellence Liaison here at Adams State. And this event is sponsored by the Equity Board, so please enjoy the refreshments here. I'd like to go ahead and provide an introduction for our speaker today. Many of you probably already know Professor Ed Crowther, and that he is a Professor Emeritus of History at Adams State University, where he taught from 1988 to 2018. He was department chair for 3 departments. That was 20 years for the HAPS department, 6 years for teacher education, and 2 years in the kinesiology department. He also served 4 terms as faculty senate president, and he continues to work as a football coach for the Grizzlies and is president of the Adams State University Foundation Board and chairs its investment committee. A native of Vicksburg, Mississippi, he worked for the Klan Watch Project and in the legal department for the Southern Poverty Law Center prior to coming to Adams State. Crowther holds the Ph.D. in history from Auburn University and is the author and editor of 3 books, most recently, The Enduring Lost Cause, and numerous articles and reviews. His publications include pieces on Dr. King and Dr. King's best-known African-American foe, Reverend Joseph Harrison Jackson. He is a sought-after speaker across the San Luis Valley. We are and we are lucky to have him. And on a personal note, if you ever run into him at the gym, call him over because you'll get your cardio done like that. So welcome, Professor Crowther, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder, for a wonderful introduction. And of course, I get longer and longer in the tooth. She started after I retired, and now she's a department chair. So I don't know what that means, except to quote my old friend Elmer McKinley Cruz Jr., I haven't done the Christian thing and died yet. I got to tell you, this has become an awesome honor for me. It was from the beginning, but I'm thinking I've done 15 of these here at Adams State and some at other venues. And there are 2 aspects about this. I mean, one, when you have an occasion, a formal occasion to prepare for a presentation on somebody like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the stuff that you are continually exposed to and re-exposed to is both a transcendent experience, but also a terribly challenging experience, because you realize that the world can be a better place if I would just try to be a little more like Dr. King. And so there's that huge piece about that rich opportunity of studying Dr. King. And the other part are you guys. And I look out and I have to, as I've gotten to be a geezer, my not cry function is not as good as it was when I was a very powerful young person. And but I look out and I see people that Dr. Nearing, Dr. Jones, and others that have been here from the beginning. I thought foolishly once, I did a talk in the early days of this series in Porter Hall 120, and it was packed. And I thought, man, what a cool thing. I didn't realize that Dr. Nearing was providing free pizza and that was the reason. But thank you, Dr. Snyder, for continuing to provide some inducement for people to turn out. And I want to thank my tech guys. They are just amazing. And Jeremy and Mike, you guys, when I hear from people who know me and connect me with Adams, and they see something on a live stream or on YouTube, and they literally have chastened me. You guys are wasting money hiring these Hollywood crews. And I go, these are Adams State people, you know. I can't help it if we're that good, you know, just one of those things. Well, so I want to turn now to why we're here. And we're here really, the King holiday, like everything else in public life, is a contentious thing. It's a commemoration, and in the 1983 legislation, it was very clear that the commemoration was really what it's supposed to be about. A decade later, Dr. Snyder could tell us all about this, the legislation was amended to create a service day component, which seemed to be a really fitting thing. But the other thing it was true in the signing statement. This is a holiday that is laden with political overtones. And, you know, I'll give the short version. I once did an entire King talk on the signing statement. But in the signing statement creating the King legislation contained what I thought were two offensively egregious flaws. That is, it's not just wrong, it's morally wrong. It's not just an intellectual affront. There's something seamy about the signing statement. And one, well, wasn't it great that we had Dr. King? He pointed out this little problem, and we've solved it and we've moved on. And I know that some people have, because they never ever grappled with the things that Dr. King was trying to point out. And then the part that offends me the most. If Dr. King had tried to speak anywhere else, they would have killed him. Note, we did on the 4th of April. And it was not just, if there's such a thing as a good death, this was not a good death. And so something I remember grappling, writing words, this is how I introduced an essay once, describing the violent way that Dr. King died. A Remington Game Master Model 760, shooting a 30-06 round at 2,750 feet per second. Entered Dr. King just below his right eye, into his spine, nearly exited under his left pectoral muscle. He essentially bled out. And of course, I'll go ahead and introduce this gentleman to you. His name is Theatris Bailey. He is the brother of the husband and wife owners of the Lorraine Motel, and he is applying a solvent to remove the blood that came from Dr. King's body, where he was living out his life, his right to speak under the First Amendment. And of course, when he fell backward from the railing, he fell back in this position, and the imprint looked like a cross. And from that day until his death, the Reverend Joseph Lawson always referred to Dr. King's martyrdom as Dr. King's crucifixion. So there's an aspect about this that, and it's really what this talk is all about. There is something to celebrate, and it's the willingness to die for something you believe in. And it's the courage to face down obstacles that most of us would struggle to imagine intellectually, let alone to confront directly. There'll be more of that. For a number of years, I've used the same Where's Elaine? You're there somewhere. Are the slides going to be different this year? Yes. But I've used the same trope. And the idea as we're now, Dr. King was born in 1929. He'd be 95 years old today. And this year we're going to observe the 56th year of his assassination. And so there's a piece about how do we get from there to now. And sadly, I could have used this title in 1964, and it's absolutely germane in 2024. And so I thought, I'm glad the graphics people aren't here because I'm about to practice aesthetics without a license, but the idea is in King's time, the apostle for nonviolent social change is living in a time of violence. This is from April 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. This was a real thing. It was not fake news. One of the more grotesque things that's happened in United States history in 1968 at My Lai 4 in South Vietnam. And for reasons that can only make sense in the most bizarre human context, we kill people in order to save them. People could say that with a straight face. And I can say it with a straight face just because I'm quoting what people said. The number 29, meaningful to anybody? It's one short of 30, but it has something to do with this picture. Arrested 29 times for exercising his First Amendment rights in the name of social justice. 29. And I want to take you through something that some of you know. Imagine being Coretta Scott King and hearing that your husband has been arrested in Alabama, because what's the most likely thing to happen? Killed while resisting arrest. You know, when Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were killed in the summer of 1964, and the FBI went trolling for bodies, randomly, you would find dead black people in rivers and streams that had just gone missing, and nobody cared. Long before the Chicks wrote about Earl, Goodbye Earl, black people could just be a missing person that nobody officially seemed to miss at all. There's a freedom song called Mississippi Rivers about this phenomenon. And then, of course, Mr. Bailey, who died about 20 years ago. He was an Air Force veteran. And, what was your life like? There's a wonderful spread in Life magazine from 1968, and I use wonderful, put that in quotes. It's incredibly useful and powerful. A photographer went and took pictures. It's funny, there's no police tape outside of the Lorraine Motel. And one of the people there is Will Campbell, the liberal Southern evangelical white guy who's there trying to console Joseph Lowry. And he took this picture. And there are a couple of others shot from the side of Mr. Bailey. I always wondered, what did he tell his grandchildren that he did on the night of April 4th, 1968? That was then, and I don't mean to get unduly heavy. There's some good things coming, but we don't get the good. There wasn't the resurrection without Golgotha. It seems like the cosmos wants to work this way. This is the fall of 2023 on a little strip of land in the Middle East, Gaza. A year ago, this is Memphis, Tennessee, when a 29-year-old delivery worker is driving home and is pulled over and severely beaten by a special unit in the Memphis Police Department. Now, one of those people has pled guilty. The other four are facing criminal prosecution. But imagine being beaten and then dying as a result of the beating in 2023 for the horrible crime of driving home from work. So here's the thesis. if nonviolence was an efficacious approach to human problems when Dr. King was alive in a world of unbelievable violence, surely it is relevant in 2024, where the names of the players have changed, but some of the conditions have not. Now, Elaine, I've got to tell you, I lied. I don't know why this isn't advancing. Let's try this. I turn that backwards. Huh. I've had technical problems like this before, but I have help. So this next slide, I got to tell you, so Elaine, you're right. This next slide is an artifact. I made this slide in 2009, so we just need to advance. And so anyway, it's the biographical slide of sort of the highlights of Dr. King. And I could pick others, but these sort of do it for my purposes. And so one of the fascinating things about Dr. King for people who live in the 21st century or people who are white from my century is that Dr. King came from the upper middle class of the African American community. His father was the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. His father even attended for a brief time a university in Germany to study theology. So it was not unusual for young Dr. King to be highly, highly, highly educated. And so he attended Morehouse College. Morehouse College is an HBCU. It's named after Henry Morehouse, who was the secretary for the American Baptist Home Missionary Society, the AHBS. Do you know who the president of that society was? I'm looking at you, Miss Brock, because John David Rockefeller. Who would have thought that John David Rockefeller did an amazing kind of paternalistic work for black colleges? So King went to Morehouse. He wanted to be a doctor. Wasn't a good student. Do you know what he got his degree in? Sociology, right? Yes. And so he got his degree in sociology, but it was his sociology professor, a man named George Dennis Sale Kelsey, who convinced Dr. King, who was having this. Dr. King's a human being. His life cycle, adolescence, you can identify with. He found his father kind of embarrassing. Not that his father was a fundamentalist. And his father was very much a creature of some traits within the African American Baptist Church that the younger generation struggle with. Whooping as a homiletical style. I'm not even going to try to imitate that for you. Google it. You can find some wonder, but it's the way that black preachers sometimes preached. The younger generation wanted a more urbane, academic setting. It was Kelsey that said, you know, there's a lot of good stuff in religion. It's okay to be smart and pursue a religious vocation. So I keep thinking I'm going to finish the book. I hope to finish it. I think Kelsey deserves a book. What did you do with your life? Well, I gave the world Dr. King. That's all I did. I only did that one thing. So Dr. King goes off to Crowther Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and he gets a Master of Divinity degree. And it's there that he meets this wonderful singer. She had a beautiful voice. She was from Perry County, Alabama, county seat Marion, Alabama, named after Frances Marion. And she didn't really want to take up with a future preacher man. She was a concert grade vocalist, beautiful voice. But eventually, Dr. King was very persistent, and they married. Dr. King went on to Boston University and earned a Ph.D. that he completed in 1955 in the spring of the year. And one of the people that he was influenced by was a guy that most of you, no reason you should have heard of this guy, but he's worth studying. His name was Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman was born in Daytona, Florida, not Daytona Beach, Daytona, which is where black folk lived. And it was unusual because he was an African-American Ph.D. He was the chaplain at Boston University. And very much a believer in the efficacy of elements of Christianity to change the hearts of people so that their behavior might improve. The part of Dr. King's career, and we're going to circle back to this because he said it in his own words better than I'm going to say it. He accepts a pastorate in Montgomery, very much against his father's wishes. His father wants him to go to Atlanta. The other option was a big church in Detroit, and he preached a trial sermon there. So imagine if Dr. King had gone to Detroit. So you think about the contingency. He goes to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, and Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is the church for the well-heeled African Americans. You're on the faculty at Alabama State, and that's where you go. And so he's there, and he's doing all the things a well-educated, ambitious young preacher would do. He forms committees. And you go, this is how churches work. In fact, the Montgomery bus boycott is essentially a church phone tree. That's what it is. But when you look at Dr. King's career, at this point, there's nothing that suggests the Dr. King that most of you have in your mind as a historical personage. But one of the people on one of his committees was a woman named Rosa Parks, but just one of those things. And here's the fascinating thing about the Montgomery bus boycott. It was supposed to last one day, and it was run by women. And interesting piece, but I'll spare you the story. So the first day was really successful. So in essence, the men take over. And in the petty religious politics that are true in every community that I know anything about, they can't find somebody to be in charge. And it obviously can't be a woman. It's got to be a preacher. And it can't be, E.D. Nixon because he's a layman and a radical. So they pick the guy that nobody knows anything about, Dr. King. They did not know what they were getting. He also did not know who he was going to become. Very early on, he learned what it might cost him. 2 months after he took over the Montgomery Improvement Association that ran the bus boycott, they bombed his house. Yolanda and Coretta were just feet from the blast area. You see, where I'm from, life is cheap. Everybody's, but especially people we just don't like. But it's the Montgomery bus boycott that catapulted Dr. King onto the national scene. And what I find fascinating, he is a public figure. He is a public figure for 76 months. He did everything that he's known for in 76 months. He's only 39 when he dies. Not bad. The success of the Montgomery bus boycott, the first exercise of organized nonviolent resistance in the city of Montgomery. It's not the first bus boycott. There was one in Tallahassee, there was one in Baton Rouge, but it's the one that stuck. The success created the need for organization. And the scholars who are critical of Dr. King point out that one of the things he was not good at was the work of organizing. And so a way of thinking about this, when Dr. King died, Joseph Lowery takes over, and most of you have never heard of Joseph Lowery, and he's a very good and decent human. But there wasn't a successor. There wasn't a succession plan. Just one of those things. But in 1957, King and his fellow preachers in the South, most of these are people that are part of the National Baptist Convention, which is the African American denominational apparatus that dates from the 1890s. Dr. King and his fellows formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they used this as an organizational arm because they could mobilize masses of people through African American churches. Sometime take a look at a volume called Between Fetters and Freedom, and you can learn about why this is so. Otherwise, not very good people who look like me, in order to appear good, had to allow black churches to exist. And black church anywhere is not like any white church. It's just not. Go to Abyssinian Baptist for Palm Sunday. I don't even have clothing good enough to dress and attend, but it's amazing because the churches do everything. They're a mutualista. Where's Nick Sines? That was for you. They're a self-help organization. They're a political organizing arm. They do social work. They do interventions, as well as just provide a safe space for black folk to hang out. And so the SCLC, which has a very tenuous relationship with existing groups like the NAACP, because that's for the highly educated people, and then later SNCC, that's for the young folk, and it is SNCC. It's SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They struggle with this church stuff. I had, years ago, Dr. Charles Payne here, and Charles makes me look small. And he talked about being a student at Syracuse University as a student radical in the 1960s. They had no use for Dr. King, DeLaude, they called him. But then he said something really powerful. He said, I do not have words to express the anger I felt when I learned that King had been murdered. Even SNCC got it, really, they did. It would be under the aegis of the SCLC that Dr. King would conduct nonviolent protest in a welter of arenas, including Albany, and it's like Albany. It's how they, if you say Albany down there, they will probably arrest you. In Albany, but then in Birmingham. And the conditions in Birmingham, white people weren't getting along. There was Albert Boutwell running against Bull Connor for the mayor's office. Boutwell won. Connor said the election was stolen. You think any of this stuff is new? Come on. But black people, led by Fred Shuttlesworth, had negotiated with the sitting leaders for black people to get jobs in the department stores. And you know the leaders reneged on their promises? And so Fred Shuttlesworth asked Dr. King to come from Atlanta. He had moved in the late 1950s from Montgomery to Atlanta, to come to Birmingham and lead a protest for economic and social justice. King gets arrested. Now, two things happen when King is arrested. One, we get the Children's March, the famous one, where school kids essentially say to their elders, we're marching. Just wanted to let you know. And the parents are understandably afraid, and they're police dogs and fire hoses. King's aides smuggle into his jail cell pieces of paper and smuggle out paper on which there's writing, and this becomes the letter from Birmingham City Jail. King was asked by his critics, what are you doing here, you outside agitator? And King says, well, you know, I'm a preacher, and we go where help is needed. I'm the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and we have a chapter in Birmingham. Oh, yes. And like the prophets in the Old Testament, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is in Birmingham. And now you know the line, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Wow. One of the most taught, whatever that means, documents in our U.S. curriculum, right? Unless you're in certain states. But obviously 1963 was a big year. And this is one of those things, I've done a King talk just on this. We were talking about this earlier. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech is a lengthy address, almost 18 minutes long. We checked. And it's a speech given at something called the March for Jobs and Justice. This notion that King didn't care about all this economic stuff, it's just not true. You know, it's false. It's a lie. And it's like most lies, there's an agenda there. If we can, what's the phrase, if we can deodorize Dr. King, you know, then he's useful for us. The real King is much more radical than that. But King's I Have a Dream speech makes him a national figure. But let me tell you about evil. He gave the speech on the 28th of August, 1963. On the 16th of September, Dynamite Bob Chambliss set off explosives in Birmingham and killed 4 little girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. One of the great books that maybe made you read this book. It was called The Color of Christ, and it begins with this scene. The 4 little girls' bodies are broken. I stopped showing the autopsy photographs because I couldn't continue. They just got to be too much. The other casualty, in the stained glass window, the face of Jesus of Nazareth was blown off. There is some bit of poetic something at work there. King's career from Montgomery through the March for Jobs and Justice got him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. He's very much an international figure. He had visited India in 1959. He's well known in a lot of places. And in the decolonizing world in Africa, he's very much a hero the way that Mandela would become a hero a quarter of a century later. Just one of those things. Things get complex. Do you know that voting rights is part of a system created in law? It operates in a political culture. It's not a bunch of individuals, mamby-pamby going around. So one of the things that King utilizes nonviolence for is to change public policy. In the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which was ratified in 1868, the amendment reads simply this, that all persons, the right to vote applies to people irrespective of race, color, previous condition of servitude. The idea was to allow black men the right to vote. Now, as I've stood in this room many times, let me help you read this like a lawyer. I can't discriminate on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's 3 things. So I can discriminate on how many things? Infinity minus 3. And that's what we did. But the second part of the 15th Amendment, and this is germane, right now we're dealing with issues about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, whether it's self-executing or not. That's a different question. But the 15th Amendment has a second clause. Congress shall have the power to carry into effect the foregoing amendment. And so in 1965, what African Americans are demanding is that Congress do something. And so on the 8th of March, 1965, citizens from all over, but mostly from the South, at this point mostly black, seek to cross the Alabama River on the south side of Selma, and then they'll hang hard east on Highway 80 and walk the distance to Montgomery. They were met by let's just call it a conspiratorial element, the Alabama Department of Public Safety. Future Congressman John Lewis had his skull fractured that day for the crime of walking while black. Just one of those things. The march was defeated. So the SCLC and SNCC turn up the heat. They gather more people. And they get LBJ to provide, that's President Lyndon Baines Johnson. I'm sorry, my age is showing. They get President Johnson to provide the assurances of security. They complete the march. This is when Johnson goes on television and gives the speech, "We shall overcome," as he lends executive support to what became the Voting Rights Act that was signed in August of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act does a lot of things. It outlaws vote dilutionary devices, stacking, cracking, and packing, things that we do deliberately to make sure that your vote doesn't count, or it certainly doesn't count as much as mine. It also created something called judicial preclearance, that when states attempted to draw voting districts, which we do every 10 years after the census, the government had to review these to see that they didn't intentionally violate the 15th Amendment. Years ago, I was walking in Tuskegee with a guy named Danny Williams, who was an expert on Tuskegee history. He was an African American and the archivist. And we're going down and we're walking a voting district. We're literally walking the lines. And we're walking like this. And black people on this side, outside the line, white people here, they're going to get to vote on this side of the line. And then we did this. We walked around a vacant lot. I said, "Why are we doing that?" He said, "That was Dr. Charles Gamaliel's house. He was a black guy living on the wrong side of the street." And they drew him out. They created a 27-sided voting district. Felix Frankfurter called it a stylized seahorse. That's why we had to have the Voting Rights Act. And sadly, I've lived long enough to watch that thing be eviscerated. Do you know why? Because we can. Here's the other piece. You know why that doesn't have to stand? Because we don't have to let it. Just one of those things. In 1966, and all this sort of goes together, 1966, Dr. King wanted to take the movement outside of the former Confederacy. And he and Coretta and the kids moved into a tenement on the south side of Chicago, and their primary goal was to desegregate housing in Chicago. Because one of the things that's happened, and it's true in Detroit, and it's true in Compton, we pack black people into tiny little neighborhoods. It's called redlining. It's a thing. And housing is disproportionately expensive because you can't build more of it. And it's unsafe and unsanitary, and all these things also help give us Motown, so it's a complex thing. I mean, that's also a fact. Dr. King, when he attempted to walk to Cicero, Illinois, pelted with rocks, he said, "I've not seen anything like this, even in Mississippi." Now, as a native-born Mississippian, let me tell you just how bad you have to be as bad or worse than Mississippi. It's almost unimaginable. But what King began to do is to realize, and he had thought about this before, realize that this stuff that we're dealing with nationally and really internationally is a kind of depravity of the human spirit, the human psyche, that yields very warped human behavior, and you can label it. And so on April the 4th, 1967, 1 year before his death, he gives a very famous sermon, and it's called Beyond Vietnam. I read this thing in the 1970s, and I'm thinking, man, this is some radical stuff, because this is what he says. He says there are two reasons, or there are two behaviors that are at the root of everything that is wrong, right? We've got racism at home and imperialism abroad, and he said these two things come from one single source, a sickness of the soul that he called acquisitive materialism. And so it's fascinating to me when I hear, well, Dr. King was just about, Dr. King is really trying to re-engineer human society and break apart not only the hardened hearts of individuals, but the systems in which they choose to operate. In early 1968, two sanitation workers in Memphis tried to escape a rainstorm by climbing into the back of their garbage truck, and it malfunctioned and they were crushed to death. The city benefit did not pay for the cost of their funerals. And so the members of the Sanitation Workers Union, they're the Association of State, County, Municipal Employees, local number 1733, they go on strike. And they ask the SCLC for help. And so they try to have a march. The Memphis Police Department, remember them? The Memphis Police Department staged a riot and broke up that march. We have tape of the police saying, permission to break up the march. They try to have a second march, and there's a snowstorm that I remember so well. We missed 2 days of school in Vicksburg, Mississippi in March because of a snowstorm. It shut Memphis down. Dr. King couldn't get there. So he goes back for a third march. And this is to happen on April the 5th, and of course he's killed the day before. But he goes there to help garbage workers in Memphis. And as one of our speakers for King Week years ago said, you know, Dr. King didn't die of no drug overdose. He died helping garbage workers in Memphis. Inasmuch as ye did unto the least of these, my brethren, you did even also unto me. Those are words that King lived by. Remember here, housing as a memorial to Dr. King. The Congress barely passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It's the Fair Housing Act. And right now, it's being gutted. I will tell you a story. Hard to believe, old enough to have this kind of a story. I'm going to work for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I'm looking for a place to live. And I'm driving out toward the Dalraida section of Montgomery, and I'm broke. I don't have any money, and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm in my 20s, you know. And I see on this wooded lot for rent. And I pull over my Nissan Sentra automobile with a 5-speed transmission and no air conditioning. Glad it was March. I go knock on the door, and an older gentleman greeted me. He said, oh gosh, yeah, I'm glad to show you this room. And then he went on this racial tirade full of N-words. I'm so glad you're looking at this property. They would otherwise make me rent it to and word rhymed with trigger. Ape was used, and I thought, you know what, if I ever get a chance to take you down, I will. But, you know, and fortunately, he didn't ask what I was doing. He was just glad to see a white person. And so a lot of people didn't like the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This is one of my favorite pictures of Dr. King. This is early in his ministry in Montgomery. This is Decatur Street, and this is Dexter Avenue. And the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is right on the corner. But there's Coretta holding Yolanda and the very young Dr. King. I would say this is about the summer of 1955. This is probably the most famous picture. Here's Bayard Rustin, here's Dr. King, and this is, of course, the I Have a Dream speech. And this is Dr. King being protected. This guy's not hurting him, he's shielding him from the rocks and bottles. This is in Chicago, a very wonderful place to be crusading for social justice. Does it work? You are just amazing. You can do all kinds of things. We'll do this rather quickly because I wanted to do the history. But this is the stuff that I think that you need, I would encourage you to reflect upon. Why did King become the Dr. King that we remember? And part of it was because he grew up in a part of the country with legal white supremacy. You know it as Jim Crow. I wish you'd call it what it is, which is legal white supremacy. That's what it is. And oh, and by the way, you see, twin racial injustice, economic injustice. I stole this from an essay that he wrote in Christian Century magazine, and they ran it again yesterday for King. He wrote this in 1960, and I purposely went and got early King stuff to try to stress the continuity. But here was a guy that grew up in a world of separate and very unequal. But here's the transition. He knew that he did not like the world into which he was born, but he had to figure out what to do about it. And so he does. I think this is just a powerful statement. I remember writing an essay on this period in Dr. King's life, and I was taken by, he did not know where he was headed. He did not know. He was just doing his job, and he's figuring out a philosophy. And here's the thing, how true to his philosophy was he? In 1956, they tried to blow up his house. In 1965, the FBI tried to blackmail him into committing suicide. 3 people personally assaulted him. One stabbed him with a letter opener, and had he sneezed, he says this in his last address, the Bend to the Mountaintop speech, he would have severed his aorta and died. These 2 guys, one is a Klansman, the other's an American Nazi Party member, got to King and just beat the hell out of him. King said about one of them, boy, he packs a mean punch. But he would not let his aides come to his defense. So the point is, the obvious point, when King talks about the efficacy of nonviolence, he's talking about the efficacy of an ideal that he lives with and embodies in a realm full of one-on-one personal violence, right? Yeah. 29 times arrested, bottles and rocks, and I can remember a former boss of mine saying, you only get to die once and it only takes 1 bullet to kill you. So King could only do the assassination thing 1 time, right? It's just 76 months. 76 months. And yet, he says this in 1967, at the height of the Vietnam War. We can either choose nonviolence, or we will have already chosen non-existence. Isn't that amazing? What an interesting idea. And so it's funny how long she lived. She's 99 years old when she died. She was mentally insane, and he was signing Stride Toward Freedom in New York, and she came up with a letter opener and stabbed him. These 2 guys went to King events. This is in Birmingham. They went up and got close to King, and you ever thought about why these white folk wanted to beat on King? Why those guys? It'll come back at some point. And I think it's this reason. It's the same reason that James Earl Ray killed Dr. King. They wanted to be able to say, look at me. Look at what I did. I went and I did this, right? And we will kill your dreamer and see what becomes of his dream. Well, to quote the late Billy Kyles, the dream still lives. And so let's see, we're right here, and maybe we'll get this thing back shortly. So there's a slide that will slowly reappear, and it's called The Sources of King's Nonviolence. And I used to do it differently because everybody wants to talk about Gandhi, and they should. They should. That just doesn't explain King. King did know about Gandhi through the president at Morehouse, who had met Gandhi, and he learned a little bit from Kelsey. But King came to nonviolence through theological study. And you have to remember, he's got a Ph.D. in theology. It's what he does. And so back when this was a thing, we don't even have this anymore in so much of U.S. Christianity, but he was heavily influenced by what's called theological liberalism. And theological liberalism has its origins after the U.S. Civil War, and it includes things like German higher criticism. But one of its functions comes out of transcendentalism and comes out of Unitarianism, and that's the idea that people are basically good. Now, if you were raised Calvinist, you know that that's not true. We're totally depraved. But for King, the liberalism was the opposite of his father's fundamentalism. And what I want to suggest is that it created the notion that the world could be better. This is where King's education and mine intersect. I was very much a devotee of Reinhold Niebuhr and neo-orthodoxy. And Reinhold Niebuhr, who started writing in the 1920s and was very influential in the 1950s, said, look, here's the deal. Yeah, you're created in the image of God, but God is so distant, it's like you're not even related. And right after World War II, do you think he didn't have a perspective on human evil? And you know what he said? You know what he said to American Christians? He said this. He said, you know, we've just had 2 world wars that show us how bad secular materialism is. I'm reading a new book called Hitler's Empire. And I thought, man, I know this stuff. It's like, you never get to the bottom of how bad it is. But then he said to the American church, he said, your self-satisfied consumerism is just as bad. Nobody wanted to hear it, but this is the piece about King. He thought that there was so much negativity, and particularly the notion of the distance from deity, that he finally began to flirt with this idea, existentialism. And so what he basically comes to with Kierkegaard and existentialism is that the way that human beings live their lives, the things that they choose to value, destroys and cripples their souls. And so you have to find a better way. I remember when this was a thing. It's a thing in some places, but this used to be the big thing in the 1920s and 30s. And this is what he says. You know, in addition to studying these abstract theologians, here's the piece. The mission of religion is to make the world a better place for the people that inhabit it. And do you notice this? There's nothing here about the individual standing before God begging for forgiveness. He says, you know, look, if we're not concerned about the slums that damn him, the economic conditions that strangle them, the social conditions that cripple them, we're not really a religion, are we? And this was very much the idea of a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch, who wrote a book that everybody read who ever studied theology in the United States called Christianity and the Social Crisis. And yes, this is a thing. And increasingly, these two sort of connect. Increasingly, as King begins to grapple with being a public person whose life is in danger, and what do you do with that, he has to develop a notion that says, look, it's possible to suffer in such a way that you elevate yourself, and by redemptive suffering, you actually change the heart of your adversaries. And so he really sees this both as a tactic and a commitment to dealing with injustice. And so absolutely, Gandhi you know, the Germans in 2 world wars couldn't topple the British Empire, but Gandhi could. Just one of those things. This is a fact, and it's funny, Bayard Rustin, there's a new biopic out on him, which I haven't seen yet. He was a very important figure in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but he's gay and he's black. So he's very important really to King personally, but you almost never see him because he's an inviting target for King's opponents. And of course, Glenn Smiley is he's an older gentleman by the time King comes on the scene. They go to Montgomery and they meet with King. And they meet with King right after the King's house was bombed, and it's a fortress. And they say, you know, you can't do this. You cannot become the thing that you're opposed to. And Dr. King told his people, thank you, but we're not going to use guns anymore. We're not. And that was mostly through the mentoring of Bayard Rustin and Glenn Smiley. A little bit about the Fellowship of Reconciliation. They're founded in 1915 by Christians in Germany, Britain, and Switzerland. They're trying to figure out, what? We've got this thing called the First World War, and we need to figure it out, or we'll have non-existence. It's that simple. This is the one that for a lot of people is kind of potentially a stumbling block. King is a supernaturalist. He believes in a transcendent deity that intervenes in the psyche of humans. That is a fact. And so for him, I see this as something that gives him a reason to keep going. He's very sure by the early 1960s that he will not live to be 40 years old. How do you keep going? And so he tells a story about going in the kitchen the night that they blew up his house. And he pours a pot of coffee, and I've called this in other contexts, the third conversion of Martin Luther King. And he hears a voice. Martin, stand up for truth. Martin, stand up for justice. Martin, stand up for righteousness. And lo, I will be with you always, even unto the end of the earth. So for Dr. King, the presence of what he would recognize as supernatural deity was a lived, daily experience. And that's part of Dr. King. And so here they are, Bayard. Niebuhr's just amazing. Rauschenbusch, he looks like, a university professor, which he was, very much. And of course, this is Smiley. This is right after Browder v. Gale, and they're riding the bus in Montgomery right after that was legalized. So just one of those things. I think this is really important because most of us can't do what King is talking about. We're afraid, and that's a part of it. And Charlie Cobb, who spoke here at Adams State University, will tell you this nonviolent stuff will get you killed. It got Martin killed. That's a fact. And here's the deal. People don't want to change, especially if it feels like giving up privilege. But here's the promise. Here's the promise. Here's the promise. The first person that has to change is not the doer of evil. It's the one confronting the evildoer. You got to become a little better than you are, or you won't be able to do this, because you will be afraid and you will back down. I thought about this today. This is the not planned part, but it just struck me today. I thought about something I heard Dr. King say. I've played the Been to the Mountaintop speech so many times. It's the last public address he gave. And he says, like many of you, I would like to live for a long time. Longevity has its place. But that doesn't matter to me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And he's allowed me to see to the other side. I may not be there with you, but I promise you that we as a people will get to the promised land together. And so tonight, I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. You see, he conquered his fear. So he was able to finish his journey. And you know, they say, and you can see this on video, he literally gives this address. He hadn't slept, and when he turns, he literally loses consciousness. You know, just the demands of being this kind of a leader. Just one of those things. So, I stole this from the Martin Luther King Papers Project at Stanford University, because if you're going to steal, steal from the best. Just one of those things. These are largely things that you have to accept as true. These are the givens in your proof. And if they're true and you believe them, you can go down this journey. You can resist without becoming like the thing you're trying to resist. I think that this is an important one. We're opposing racism. We're not demonizing the racist. And that's a hard one to do. That's a really hard one to do. Suffering as redemptive. You see, as a Bible-believing Christian, Dr. King believed that he was to bear the same cross that Jesus bore, that he had to be obedient unto death. That's what he believed. And so we often want to have nonviolent resistance, but we want protection and security. And this is the thing that has kind of driven my thinking the last 6 weeks or so. We want to be on the winning side. And there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that we'll be on the winning side. You might get damaged. You know what happened to people who filed suit to fight white supremacy? If you had a public employment job, we fired you. If you had a loan, we called it in. And then people who look like me just went by and beat the hell out of you. And there are no witnesses, and there's nobody who looks like you that's going to be on the jury. You know, we want to, and so why I think there's some efficacy here, the people that did this then lived in a very deadly world and were willing to do it either. Anyway, this is something that I find fascinating, and I want to approach it this way. King believed in the laws of nature and nature's God. He believed in gravity, electromagnetism, strong force, weak force. He believed in those things. They explain observable conditions, and we can make predictions based on our observations that are validated by repeated observation. King believed that moral law was part of natural law. While many of us might argue that the universe is indifferent, you know, that's how we approach things. For King, it can't be indifferent. The universe created by God, who created natural law, the universe would contain the moral law. And so for King, this is a source of optimism. And so he plagiarized. He borrowed this from Theodore Parker, who wrote these words about 1862. The moral arc of the universe is long. Think about time from the moment of consilience, almost 14 billion years. But it bends toward justice. Pretty good stuff. And so here's the piece. King is advocating this, living this, embodying this, encouraging others to do this at a time when it was extremely dangerous. And literally, they're not wanting this to happen, but they're sure that it will. When they march, they'll get arrested. They'll get struck with police batons. They'll go to jail. And the thing that's amazing to me is that they do this anyway. And you know, the example, of course, is Gandhi, having he and his pilgrims marching to the sea, It was against the law for Indians to make salt. How hard is it to make salt out of water from the Indian Ocean? Nature takes care of that. And so you're trying to show how stupid this is. And so they make, and the threat for, this is what Gandhi was willing to risk. Those Maxim guns, those automatic weapons, locked and loaded. But the British weren't willing to do it, but they might have. But it exposed how silly this was. I put this up here, so I hope you'll read this book. I love this book. And when I ordered it, it starts off with Dr. King, even though that's not what the book is about, but I just thought, well, we'll call that some kind of a sign. But one of the challenges that all of us have, at least some of the time, is whenever we confront something difficult, we want to see the pathway. We want to know what the next step is. Do you know that Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech was improvised? The first 10 minutes are carefully scripted, and they bombed. Tell them about the dream, Martin. And he does. And the piece about that, and Jackson, she's got some really cool stuff that psychologists would love. Our creative selves are when existentially we accept the fact that we don't know the next step, and we take it anyway. But Dr. King was already there, right? You can't see the staircase. You just know you have to take the next step. And you know, bad things can happen in the dark. But here's the thing, if you don't take the step, what's going to happen? And King had a take on this that I found. I thought about this and I thought, gosh, I've been missing this all along. On the night before he was assassinated, he re-preaches Luke chapter 10. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. And so the priest and the Levite, rather than stopping and rendering aid to the man who had fallen among thieves, they passed by on the other side. And King says, you see, their problem was they thought, if I stop, what will happen to me? The Samaritan thought, if I don't stop, what will happen to him? If you don't take that step, things don't get better. And bad things happen to other people. This is how we actually got in this direction. I found some of this, for me, convicting. Not the first part. That's sort of easy. Dr. Nearing, you know, however imperfectly I practice, I believe this. This is what's harder for me. It's harder for me to respect the dignity of people that I disagree with, particularly when it comes to issues of race, class, and gender. I act like I'm superior, and that is so ineffective. But fundamentally, it keeps you from the engagement of doing the hard work on the journey, on the Jericho road of life. Just one of those things. And so I wonder, I actually put this one. I sure would like to no, you can't have those thoughts. They will get in the way of achieving betterment. They will every time. This one fascinates me about King. One of the reasons the young people didn't like him so much, they didn't like this nonviolent stuff. They had read writers like Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. And so as Africa's decolonizing, he's saying that people have endured generations of being put down. They need retribution in order to heal. And boy, that's a powerful idea. In this very room, I've told classes of people how much I admire the abolitionist John Brown at Pottawatomie Creek. He would say, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. And he would take a broadsword and hack a pro-slavery militia member into pieces. Good, I thought. No. For Dr. King, nonviolence meant not only toward those that you love and respect, but those that are hard to love and hard to respect. Otherwise, you run the risk of becoming what they are. And so I'm thinking about our current politics, and I'm thinking about current issues. Is nonviolence relevant in these complex times? I'm going to assert that for the really courageous, it's not only relevant, it's essential. But if you think it's going to be cheap grace, you're deluding yourself. That's the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. So for Dr. King, one of the most powerful examples that he represents, at a time that it could get you killed, he followed a set of practices that produced some social change. Some things are better than they were 50 and 60 years ago. And I think one of the weaknesses that some of us have, I certainly do, we don't want to have to continue the work. We don't, because it's hard. It's hard. But if Dr. King is right, you take that yoke upon you, and the burden is light because of who you're able to become. Imagine not fearing any man. I was going to do a thing about AR-15. I really wanted to do that, and I realized I couldn't do it. But then I thought about, well, I did all this reading. Here's part of the talk. You know why we don't have open casket funerals for school shooting victims like we did for Emmett Till? There's nothing you can put in a coffin. We cremate the victims because they're so badly mutilated. We face lots of challenges, but we already have the tools within us, individually and collectively, to deal with them. Just one of those things. So, anyway, the next slide was going to have two books, so I'm just going to tell you what they are. And then Heidi, Dr. Snyder, there's a bibliography attached to the QR code from last year. In 2023, we had a new King book published by Jonathan Eig, E-I-G, and it's phenomenal. You think, we've said the last word on Dr. King. Nope, wrong. And then, of course, there's another book called Martin Luther King, The Inconvenient Hero, because we always want to, sterilize Dr. King, and that doesn't capture, really, the challenge that Dr. King was willing to embrace, and it doesn't capture the challenge that's set before us. So, at this point, I'm going to stop. If you have questions or comments, we've got microphones. I'll make something up. If you have a question, I'll do my best. And I'm just so glad that you're here. Does anybody have a question or comment? So what's the significance of 29? You got an A. Good job. Yeah, there you go. Well, I probably didn't say it loudly enough. Well, thank you all again for attending, and I really, really appreciate your being here. Take lots of sandwiches because otherwise they go in an ash can somewhere. And next year, I suppose we'll do this again.
Thank you for attending. For those that wish, there's the QR code to the bibliography, and then we will have a day of service. State University is collaborating with the Fuente on Saturday from 10 to 2. And so if you'd like to sign up to be a part of the day of service, there's a QR code over there on the colorful poster, and you can sign up. So we would love to see as many people as possible to follow in the footsteps of Dr. King as an amazing advocate, social justice leader, and service-oriented community.
Thank you.